Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something incredibly heavy, but absolutely crucial to understand. We're unpacking a deeply personal story about fraternal betrayal and the complete loss of sanctuary. And as you'll see, we're going to look at how one man's individual tragedy actually exposes a massive, glaring systemic failure. So let's jump right into the core of this. I want to pose a question that really sets the stakes here. What happens when family becomes a leverage point? Think about that for a second. The source material highlights this haunting suspicion from Kyle. He felt that his familial relationships, the very bonds we literally rely on for safety, were inadvertently turned into a control mechanism. We're looking at a scenario where structural systems actively weaponize family dynamics. It is a terrifying concept, and honestly, it forms the entire bedrock of Kyle's tragedy. To really grasp the gravity of this, just listen to Kyle's own words. He says, "I've already sacrificed the most critical thing in my entire existence." Wow, that is just a raw, devastating acknowledgement of profound personal loss. This all stems from the complete disintegration of his genuinely bonded marriage to his wife, Emily, which basically threw his whole life into total chaos. That intense, unfiltered grief, that's the anchor for our explainer today. We're looking at a guy who feels he's already lost everything that matters, which perfectly sets the stage for the cascade of betrayals that hit him next. Okay, so let's walk through the actual timeline of how Kyle's physical sanctuary completely unraveled, leading up to what he sees as this ultimate fraternal betrayal. Background 2020, right in the middle of these intense legal disputes, Kyle is legally locked out of his own condominium. Boom, instant displacement. Then, months later, the logistics just completely fall apart. He's living out of his car, the car breaks down, and he can't even transport his worldly possessions to a storage unit. So, his belongings are moved to his brother Ian's place. Which brings us to the present. Kyle claims that instead of safeguarding his stuff, Ian actively sold his belongings, basically cementing Kyle's ongoing state of homelessness. Now, there's a huge contrast here when it comes to what we expect from our families. Normally, society views a sibling, especially a brother, as a sanctuary, right? Family is supposed to be your ultimate safe harbor when the whole world turns against you. But Kyle's reality, at least according to the sources, paints a completely different picture. He doesn't see his brother Ian as a protector anymore. Instead, he sees him as a proxy for the state's marginalization. Because Ian participated in stripping away his assets, Kyle genuinely perceives him as acting hand in hand with the very systems that disenfranchised him in the first place. Let's break down the logistical nightmares that made this betrayal so much worse. When Kyle was locked out of his condo, he was forced to live in his car. That was literally his final remaining sanctuary in the world. But then, and this is just a massive blow, the sources detail that his vehicle died on him. This physically prevented him from getting his remaining possessions into a secure storage unit. So out of pure necessity, those last few items were surrendered to Ian's control. And how does Ian respond to his brother being this vulnerable? Well, according to Kyle, Ian just ceased all communication. He refused to answer messages for years, completely isolating his own brother. You can feel the emotional weight of this in Kyle's own blunt words. He says, "He's also sold all of my stuff. She put my stuff in his place, and then he sold it." I mean, it is impossible to ignore the impact of that. Imagine your worldly possessions, the physical anchors of your life, all your memories, just being liquidated by your own sibling while you're out on the street homeless. It's a total, absolute erosion of trust and the complete dismantling of any sanctuary he had left. And because he had absolutely zero leverage left, Kyle was forced into some incredibly desperate financial decisions. We're talking about a staggering figure here, $10,000. Kyle claims he was forced to sell his portion of a condominium, a highly valuable piece of real estate, for that absolute pittance, 10 grand. And why would he take such a massive hit? Well, the source material reveals he did it simply as a condition to secure a single conversation with his mother-in-law. He literally sacrificed a massive financial asset just to try and reestablish a tiny line of communication with his estranged family. So you're probably asking yourself, how on earth does someone end up selling a condo for 10 grand just to get a phone call? The answer is simple. He had no formal legal advocate. The sources make it crystal clear that Kyle was entirely unrepresented during this whole process. He had zero legal leverage to negotiate his assets fairly. When you get thrown into a complex legal dispute without a professional in your corner, the power imbalance is just monumental. Kyle's devastating financial loss happened precisely because he was forced to navigate this highly adversarial system completely on his own, without any formal legal shield. Section 2. The Divorce Industrial Complex. when family law becomes an industry.
To really get what Kyle is critiquing here, we need to define the exact term he uses, the divorce industrial complex. The source material defines this as a systemic, profit-driven structure within family law that allegedly drains resources and impoverishes vulnerable individuals. Basically, Kyle argues that the system functions like a bureaucratic meat grinder. It's a framework that, instead of actually helping people find equitable resolutions, thrives on dragging out the conflict, draining everyone's bank accounts, and ultimately leaving the most vulnerable folks totally marginalized and destitute.
The sources lay out a step-by-step process of how this complex systematically strips away a person's defenses. It starts in step 1 with that initial loss of legal representation we talked about, forcing the person to advocate for themselves against seasoned professionals. Step 2 is the continuous grinding drain of both your financial and emotional resources. Then, step 3 is where you see a cascading bureaucratic failure. Access to justice and basic protections just evaporate. And finally, step 4, total vulnerability. Without money, without legal aid or state protection, you're left completely exposed to leverage from both antagonistic family members and the state itself. Moving on to Section 3, Canada's property rights void, the legal architecture of displacement. Now, you might be wondering, how does a person legally lose their home and their car without any recourse? Well, during the research for this, a pretty shocking piece of historical context came up. It turns out fundamental property rights were actually left entirely out of the Canadian Constitution back in the 1980s. This was the result of a political compromise at the time. And this isn't just a fun fact, it created a massive legal void. This omission built an environment where individuals can technically, completely legally, lose all their assets and leverage without constitutional protection. This structural vulnerability is exactly what set the stage for Kyle's total disenfranchisement and the legal dismantling of his sanctuary. So we've got this legal framework, but we also have to look at the sociological clash happening here. On one side, you have Kyle's loud, chaotic, unfiltered cries for help, which the sources describe as raw, authentic human pain. But on the other side, you've got a bureaucratic and social system that demands cold, sterile, managed optics. These manipulative systems, they thrive when everything is quiet, tailored, and orderly. So when someone like Kyle is out there communicating immense distress loudly and uncomfortably, they completely clash with this world of managed messaging. And because of that, they end up deeply misunderstood and actively marginalized by society. Which leaves us with this haunting, universal question to wrap up our explainer today. Why exactly does society turn away from raw pain? By looking at the betrayal by Kyle's brother and his subsequent disenfranchisement, we can actually see how macro-level systems rely on our collective avoidance of micro-level trauma. When we look away from the messy, uncomfortable reality of someone losing their sanctuary, we're quietly empowering the sterile, bureaucratic systems that allow it to happen in the first place. It is a really heavy thought, but it's an absolutely essential one if we want to understand how family, law, and society all intersect. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I really hope this leaves you with a lot to think about.